All right, so let's break down Biden's proposed budget of 2025. Proposed budget was $7.3 trillion for fiscal 2025. That starts in October of 2024. It's up 18% from 2023. Projected deficit $1.78 trillion, which is similar to the deficits we ran in 23 and 24. The budget projects an average deficit of $1.6 trillion per year over the next decade. National debt, as Freeberg was alluding to, is insane. It's at $34.5 trillion. But we made some charts here to go through all of this. Let's pull up the first chart. And this is comparing Biden's proposed budget in 2025 with budgets from 2005 and 2015. Defense spending has actually grown pretty modestly during that time, but entitlements, interest payments, and non-defense spending have jumped significantly. U.S. will owe $965 billion in interest on its debt next year. That's $65 billion more than the proposed defense budget. And in 2026, the U.S. will surpass $1 trillion on interest owed on its debt. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. But let's start here with this first chart. Anything jump out to you, Chamath, here that's notable and worth discussing?
All the areas that we need to cut, we can't even have a conversation about. So they'll never get cut and they'll keep growing. So I think that we probably need to figure out what the alternatives are. So if you can't have a conversation about expenses, the only logical place is to have a conversation about revenues. And what that means for the government is in taxation. And so I don't know, Jason, what we do here. There could be a couple of saving graces. So there are some things happening, for example, on the Medicare side that could be profoundly disruptive. They are, now I'm just going to put this out there as it's happening. I don't know if it's good or bad, but they are looking at reimbursing things like Wegovy and Ozempic and whatnot. If you look at the underlying costs of those kinds of chronic diseases, diabetes, heart disease, etc., and you put a large swath of the American population on those drugs, the reimbursement value of those drugs versus the cost of actually the chronic care management would save you many hundreds of billions of dollars a year. So that's something. Second is on the defense side, there's a large portion of that budget that's migrating away from traditional tactical warfare to things that are unmanned vehicles and cyber and whatnot. That could save $200 or $300 billion there. So there are places where you could save $500 billion to $1 trillion. But I think it's going to be a almost impossible conversation, and it'll happen by accident. So then the only forced conversation that I think we are going to have as a society is around taxation. And that's really bad for, a lot of people that don't believe that's the path to generating growth.
One of the challenges is that there are, and we should reference these in the show notes, Nick, but there are well-researched economic studies that show that when a government tries to increase the taxation level north of 20% of GDP of that economy, that you actually see GDP growth go negative. That there's a certain natural equilibrium on which you can tax the system. Beyond that level, investment dollars go down and growth begins to shrink. And that's what triggers the spiraling problem, because then the government spending needs to go up to continue to grow and support growth in the economy. And it creates this inevitable spiraling.
Would you call this the Atlas Shrug effect? As investment goes down?
There's a Fred chart showing percent of GDP that's federal tax receipts and then percent of GDP that's spending.
Exactly.
And the gap is your deficit, okay? And Freeberg's right that I think in the absolute best economy, or best years of the best economies, so it's like, the best year of the Reagan boom and the best year of the Clinton boom when we had the government surplus, I think the government was extracting just shy of 20% of GDP. And in the 70s, when marginal tax rates were at 70%, so before the Reagan tax cuts, we were actually extracting a lower percentage of GDP. So there's only so much blood you can get from a stone. If you raise tax rates on a marginal basis high enough, the economy performs worse and you actually end up collecting less, or people spend a lot more money on lawyers and accountants to basically figure out more structuring schemes to avoid paying taxes. So the years in which we've got the highest percentage of revenue out of the economy are in good economic years where we've had reasonable levels of taxation as opposed to the highest levels of taxation. And so the problem is with the spending. I mean, we used to be able to keep spending to somewhere between, I would say in the best years of the years of the Clinton surplus, I think spending as a percent of GDP was like 18.8%. It's around 20% of GDP goes to federal spending. That was normal. But then the spending got out of control during COVID and it went up to like 25, 30% of GDP went to federal spending. It's starting to come down, but it's still way too big a number. Anyway, my point is that a starting point for dealing with next year's budget is free spending, just free spending. The 18% increase is not a good idea. If we want to get this problem under control, freeze the spending. We can talk about taxation, but you're only going to get so much blood from a stone.
And increased spending is stimulatory, and so it works well in an election year. I would say we took two major crises, and we had crisis-level spending, and then we normalized that spending and allowed it to carry forward, starting with the '08 financial crisis with our monetary policy, and then being accelerated with COVID and our fiscal policy. I'll give you guys, I did some back-of-the-envelope math. I'm sure there are economists who have done a better job of this than I. There are directly 3 million Americans that are directly employed by the federal government. There's 167 million workers in the US. So 3 million are directly employed by the federal government. If you take the rest of the federal spending that flows into the economy, it's about $3.5 trillion a year. And assume 30% of that capital goes to equity holders in businesses that own businesses that benefit from that spending, and the rest flows through to labor. That's about 13% of GDP flowing through to labor. And assuming average annual income, that's another roughly 45, 50 million people that are directly benefiting, that are directly earning income because of federal spending. There's another 50 million people in the US that rely on Social Security. And here's another important statistic. There's somewhere between 12 and 20 million people in the US that pay more than 50% tax rate today. So those people are effectively working for the federal government because half of their income goes back to the government. So when you add this all up, there's over 120 million people in the US that are directly working for or getting paid by the federal government in the US. That is such a significant percentage of our economy. That is such a significant dependency on individual income on a federal government. I don't want to use the term socialism, but the ability for U.S. labor to earn is so largely dependent and largely driven by federal spending at this point, it becomes this critical linchpin to enabling progression economically, to enabling the labor force to continue to participate, that the federal government is now the primary customer or employer of most of the labor force in the United States today. That is a deeply and profoundly different circumstance than what I think the founding fathers envisioned when the federal government was supposed to be this lightweight, overseeing organization of a federated republic of states. And unfortunately, I think we find ourselves in a condition, as Jamaat points out, that's very hard to get out of. This is going to require a dedicated multi-decade effort to create a slow unwinding from this deep dependency that our labor force has on federal spending. And I'm just so shocked that this isn't the critical problem of our day that we're not all spending time on. Folks have pointed out that this only goes one way at this point.
Hey, Nick, can you bring up that first Fred chart? This is federal receipts as percent of GDP, and it goes all the way back to World War II. To Freeberg's point, we've never gone above 20%. Look at that. And we've had tax rates as high as 90%. I'm saying top marginal tax rates as high as 90%, I think, after World War II, because we're trying to get out of the deficit that was created by the war spending.
You can't get above 20.
Yeah, exactly.
The economy shrinks.
No, but hold on. I gave you this OECD report. It says that since 2000, we've been in the mid-20s, and the OECD average is 34 in terms of tax to GDP.
Tax to GDP, this includes state and local then, right?
Probably, yeah.
Yeah, I just showed federal.
I think this probably includes state and local.
Yeah,
which, by the way, is a whole nother ballywag because I didn't include those numbers in my employment statistics. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics estimates that about 20.2 million Americans are employed by local and state governments, directly employed by local and state governments. So again, when you add this all up, the majority of the U.S. labor force is employed by the government or is a beneficiary of the government as the primary customer or is supported by government entitlement programs.
If you go back to that Fred chart for a second, I mean, if you basically acknowledge the point that 20% is the ceiling on how much we can extract from an economy based on 80 years of data, okay, with all sorts of differing tax schemes, then I think what we should say is that federal spending will be capped at 20% of GDP.
Yeah.
We should, you see what I'm saying? Like if we can't go above 20% on receipts,
That's it.
Cap federal spending at 20%.
That should be a constitutional amendment.
Right.
That's it.
And then on the revenue side, we should say, what is the best tax code to achieve that 18, 19, 20%? Because what we do right now is we just say, well, just tax the rich. But what we've seen is we've been taxing the rich as high as 90% in the past, and you didn't get more revenue. So we should be much more scientific about saying, well, given that our target is, let's say, 20%, what's the best way to do that? And no one really has that conversation.
No, none of the conversations have to do with data or building a bulletproof system. The same thing we could say about immigration, where we try to talk about the numbers here of what's a reasonable number of people and tying that to an actual number. And it's pretty obvious we should have one immigration policy when we have 5% unemployment and a different one if we had, God forbid, 15 or 20% unemployment.
But can we just stay
it
on
could be
budget for a
tied
second?
to the unemployment rate.
The fundamental structural problem I'm highlighting is that we've created an economy that is so deeply dependent on federal spending, that the federal spending levels are what support so many employed and so many companies in the US.
You're answering your own question. That's why I can't stop.
Right.
I don't think the real economy that creates all the innovation and all the value and all the good paying jobs, I think that is separate from what the government does.
That's the deflationary economy. That's the true market-based deflationary economy. The problem is once we've layered in all of these layers of dependency from federal dollars flowing into businesses or into people's pockets, it's very difficult to back out of that.
I don't call that dependency. I call that special interests. I think there's a lot of special interests who are basically looting the federal government and taking all this money, and then they turn around and use some of it to donate back to the politicians and lobby for more spending. So what you're calling dependency is really more special interests, meaning that I don't think we need to have this level of spending in order to have a successful economy. No. I think it makes our economy less successful.
Yeah.
It's still stimulatory because, Sachs, remember Mitch McConnell, when they were talking about supporting Ukraine, his primary argument, as you remember, was that all of these dollars are going to go into defense contractors' pockets, which is going to go to employees' pockets, which is going to stimulate our economy. That's the fundamental thinking.
But that doesn't create value.
I know, but that's the thinking behind it, right? I mean, that's the political system.
Okay, let me just walk through this real quick. If the government prints a bunch of money and hands it to people as stimmy checks, we all understand that creates no economic value. It just creates inflation. Okay, now, if the government does the same thing, but instead of a stimmy check, pays people to dig holes and fill them back up, that's the exact same thing. No economic value, just inflation. Now, let's say the government pays people to create bombs that create holes in other countries. Exact same thing. No economic value for the country. It just creates inflation here. Why is that? Because the only thing that creates economic value in the United States is the production of goods and services that people can actually consume and use and that they want. And so federal spending on basically make work projects or things that people don't really want or they don't use, or even worse, bombs that get dropped on poor people in other countries, none of that creates any value. But I don't think it's a real economic dependency. I think it is just a special interest that keeps lobbying for all this stuff. But
Sachs, what about housing and healthcare and education? Because those are the three biggest line items, and it's been inflationary across all three of those line items in the U.S. economy. The federal government has stepped in to provide broader access to housing, broader access to healthcare, and broader access to education. And in the process...
That's why the price goes up.
Yeah.
You know, there's that famous chart showing inflation by category. And all the categories where the federal government provides subsidies, the prices have gone up. And all
education,
the categories...
healthcare.
Yeah.
And housing.
The more the government tries to subsidize it, the more the providers realize, wait a second, we can charge whatever we want because the government's paying.
There's one customer, and they'll always pay.
Yeah.
There's one
so
customer.
That's got to be completely reformed.
Yeah, here's a chart of all employees in government. And I think this Fred chart includes all employees in government, which would include state and local. And as you can see, we're
Yeah, that's right. It's 20 million
Yeah.
local and state, 3 million federal.
Yeah.
And then the math I was highlighting was just my back of the envelope math, where there's 50 million people that are on Social Security in the US. Plus, if you do the math on how government spending flows into into employees' pockets, it's about another 45, 50 million people that benefit from federal spending in the US. We're already kind of at a point of maximal dependency, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at this chart, we have had 20,000 people working in government since the
20
late
million.
90s. Yeah,
20 million.
20 million since the late 90s. It's now hitting a peak. And the question is, how far up does it go from here? It's 23. Obviously, the country is growing as well each year. So as a percentage, we don't have the percentage, but as a percentage of Americans, it hasn't grown that dramatically, but it certainly feels like this could keep going in the wrong direction.
The one thing to keep in mind from all the doomsdaying, I would just offer you 2 data points. The first is that our debt to GDP, either historically but also in relation to other countries, is still relatively reasonable. And what that basically shows is we have a lot more debt that we can issue, which means that there's a lot more deficits to run. Not saying that it's right.
Yeah, before the great financial crisis, it was running at 50, 60%, our debt as a percentage of GDP. And to your point, Chamath, it's now at 1.2. It's 120%. Other countries have much higher.
So we have a lot more to run. Yeah, so Nick, if you want to just throw that up. And so it means that the countries on the right haven't failed. They haven't done great necessarily, but they haven't failed in the way that we would define failure. And it's not as if the countries on the left are crushing it, the way that we would define crushing it. And so it's not clear that there's a real correlation between debt to GDP and the performance over large longitudinal periods of times as a country. That's the first thing I'll say. The second thing is, if you actually look at all of these countries, the thing to keep in mind is where our population's growing and shrinking. Because at a very basic level, J. Cal, you mentioned this earlier, but when countries are shrinking, there's no fundamental ability to grow GDP. And you're just debating how much it shrinks. And the interesting thing about the United States is we are the only Western country that is forecasted to grow at reasonable rates above our replacement population. And so, by the end of this century, we'll be around 400 odd million individuals, and other countries will have been cut in half. And so, again, there's some positive news as well. Now, to your earlier point, the problem is politicians will use this as a reason to continue spending because they won't be forced to. And that's not a great thing, but this is probably why the status quo will go on for a very long time. So grab the bag, get your bag. figure out what your thing is.
I don't know, man. I just want people, like voters, people to just
they're not
understand.
going to.
Yeah,
they're not going to. Get your bag, like everybody else.
The problem we have is Nick, can you pull up the Fred spending chart?
We've talked about this a few times.
Well, okay, so if you look there's a huge spike because of COVID, because of all that COVID stimulus that was airdropped in the economy. I think we're now down to about 22% for 2023.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a big number. We talked about how the absolute max you can extract is 20%. So what they should do is just freeze spending until the federal net outlays as a percent of GDP is down to 20%. That would be the simplest
Such
thing.
an easy solution. What's great about it is it takes out the politicians making this partisan. Hey, there is a logical amount of, taxation we can do before we freeze up the productivity of the country, which if you talk to anybody, when taxes get high, people just start protecting their wealth. I think you alluded to that with strategies as opposed to investing.
The hard part of it is that, I think we should do it, 20% cap and free spending until we get there. The hard part is that our interest expense keeps growing because as our debt rolls onto more expensive, higher interest bonds, then our interest expense is increasing. Just a few years ago, our interest expense was only $300 billion a year. And now it's over $1 trillion a year. And that's just going to keep growing and growing. And then the other thing that's going to grow is all the entitlements related to demographics. So the country's demographics are getting worse. And so the entitlement expenses are going to go up. So even holding it to 20%, if we could get there, is going to take some work.
I don't know if you read Larry Fink's letter from BlackRock. It was really good. And he talked about.
You mean his 2030 business plan, Jacob?
Basically, yeah, it's his way of extracting value from it. But he did make some salient points in it, as opposed to just him talking his book of why you should do your retirement savings with BlackRock is a fair point. But just getting what age do people retire at? That discussion we need to have, and we're not having that as a country. And then what percentage of benefits do people get at different? How do we incentivize people to stay in the workforce?
Well, at a minimum, don't you agree we should just allow people to opt out of Social Security, and in a simple way of saying, I don't need it and I'll take care of myself, use these proceeds for somebody else that could use it, who has a better need for it?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and then getting people to participate in their 401ks, at an earlier age and defaulting those to on as of defaulting them to off. There's a lot of small behavioral things we could do in this country to get people saving earlier.
Well,
I saw that Robinhood was running a scheme where if you moved your Roth IRA, they gave you 3% cash back. And I thought, is there an upper bound limit on on how much you could move over? Because I wonder if I could
you have to keep your money in there for 5 years. Yeah.
But that's okay. I'm just wondering, will they really write $100 million check if you move
Actually,
a $5 billion Roth over?
Robinhood just sent me something. So we had a portfolio company called X1, which was making a new credit card app. It was awesome. I don't know if you guys used it. Anyway, they got acquired by Robinhood. And so the guys there just sent me their new Robinhood gold card.
Gold card. Yeah.
This thing is the heaviest card. Here, just listen to it drop. Hold on.
Don't cut yourself. Don't cut your toe off.
Apparently, it's got $1,100 worth of gold in it. That's what
I have one coming myself, and I'm proud to say I've sold no shares of my Robinhood. I keep all my Robinhood shares.
If I move my Roth IRA, they'll have to give me the whole building.
They'll give you a gold-plated building.
Actually, they sent it to me in a Louis Vuitton wallet. This is unbelievable. Yes, it's got.
And look, they got a $50,000 ad on.
And then
they got a $50,000 ad on the program.
Look at this. You got a little LV wallet there.
Oh, I like it.
There you have it, folks. Send a Louis Vuitton wallet, get a free $50,000 ad on the pod. Sign up now for your Robinhood Gold. Yeah.
But what is it, a credit card?
Yeah, it's a credit card.
It's a credit card. Yeah. Their whole plan was always to provide the full suite of services.
Do you guys carry credit cards and money? Do you have any money?
Forgetting my wallet, but I always carry money.
You have money?
I always carry money.
To tip people or something?
Always have some cashish. You always got to have a couple of hundy, just in case. It's a really bad habit. You got to keep a couple of hundy in the bag.
You put the 100 on the outside, Jake, and there's a bunch of ones.
No, we don't do that. You get caught doing that in Brooklyn, you get your ass.
Got the Brajol on the outside?
No. What we do is we get rid of the ones, the 5s and the 10s. You just get rid of those. You don't even keep them in circulation. That's the best line.
I get cash when I go to Vegas, but that's the only time.
The best line ever was this woman comes up to Sammy Davis Jr. and she says, "Hey, can you break this whatever amount of money?" And he just pulls out 100 and gives her 100. And she says, no, can you make change? He says, that is change, baby. That is change. And that's what he considered change, was the 100.
There was a story out of Jeju. So, Triton Poker?
Yes.
Okay, I'm not going to say who it is, but there's a guy that was playing the high stakes cash game. And apparently, so he lost $8 million. Okay. He tipped out $450K and $25K chips to the staff and the person giving him a massage and stuff. So it apparently became a free for all trying to get into this game where everybody was like, are we pooling tips? Are we pooling tips? And they were like, no, we're not pooling tips. Just flags. He was tipping off flags.
Wow. That is incredibly, incredibly generous.